Tom, here in the United States, 5 states have now passed extended producer responsibility laws, EPR laws. And more states, some as many as 9 to 15, depending on what you read, an additional 9 to 15 are considering EPR laws. What do you think of extended producer responsibility regulation here in the United States as a circular economy solution?
Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me. It's interesting, this whole concept of EPR and what it does and what it does not do. For context, perhaps, so that you know where I'm answering the question from, TerraCycle's been around for 23 years, and we operate in mostly developed markets around the world. So Canada, US, Brazil, all of Western Europe and the UK, China, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. I'm mentioning that because that is where I'm drawing my answer from, right? And there's many more countries around, around the world. Within those markets, Europe has had, in almost all countries, what one would say is robust federal EPR type regulation for decades now, famously like the Grüne Punkt in Germany and so on.
Canada, the green dot, as we know it here in the United States, yes?
Exactly correct. And, Canada has passed it provincially, which is what we see echoing in the US, passing it state by state. I think there is one of the challenges that the business community will say is 50 different forms of EPR regulation is going to be very challenging to administer, especially when, as a producer, you may not know what state your product is sold in the very end. I may, if I'm a producer, sell to a Walmart and ship to their distribution center, and they're going to choose where that ends up and in what state it occurs. So there's going to be a bit of a bureaucratic challenge on administration.
Well, now, don't you think that a large state like California might kind of be the de facto national standard if you do, as a brand owner, decide to comply worst case scenario and go from there?
Well, so it's a good question. So if let's say California and compare, say, EPR regulation to a truth in labeling regulation that they're passing or have passed called Senate Bill 343. So California, because it is so large, has the ability to become effectively a legislative bully state. What that means is that it can pass regulation, and when a company chooses to comply with California, it will then just do that across the entire country, because it's too difficult to have a California version of one's product and a non-California version of one's product. And this shows up in all forms of regulation, whether it's like fertilizer labels or, Senate Bill 343 is truth in recycling labeling. There, it certainly becomes effectively a de facto national standard unless you are only supplying your product in a non-California jurisdiction. Inversely, EPR, because there's a fiscal mandate against it, really is bounded by the state. It is about the product sold in that state versus Oregon's EPR is about the product sold in Oregon. And it's almost like a sales tax, if you will. So this is actually a good segue to talk about what really is EPR and what it is not, because I think that's going to help frame everything from here. Generally speaking, at least my understanding of EPR, extended product responsibility, is that it is about who pays the bill for recycling. Maybe even let's take a step back. Why is there even a bill for recycling, right, to contend with? And that is because recycling is about focusing on, can we create circular solutions to waste? We have the cost, that would be like, the material being used to make something else. We have the cost of collecting that waste and processing it, and that cost is then compared to what the material can be sold for. So, for example, something like solid gold is highly circular because it is incredibly valuable. If you and I saw gold littered on the street, we would pick it up and sell it at a pawn shop. There's no need for external subsidy. But other materials are less exciting economically. And so subsidy helps subsidize the cost of perhaps collecting it or processing it, or you can subsidize end markets. Anywhere you subsidize, it helps make the economics better. And then certain items can become circular when they were not before through recycling. So there needs to be some, go ahead, please.
You talk about subsidy. Who is subsidizing this? Because various people could be the one to subsidize it. You could be talking about the citizens, which currently are the ones who do that through waste management fees, as well as taxes, correct?
Yes, and I think, so if you zoom out, because every EPR regulation could be written slightly differently, but generally speaking, the way EPR is written is it takes the cost. It's always citizens, by the way, pay in the end. There's no other possible actor, right? Because if a corporate pays, it shows up in a price increase. If it's a municipality pays, it shows up in our property taxes. We always pay, citizens. Now, historically, waste management costs and subsidizing recycling would be borne by the municipality. That means that it shows up in our property taxes, which if we're a renter, shows up in the price of rent, or if we're a homeowner, it shows up directly in paying property taxes. That is where it has historically been.
Yes.
And what EPR tends to do, not always, but tends to, is move it away from that into producer's pay, which means it shows up in the price of our product. And that is the real shift. And that is, in essence, all EPR really is in its core. Now, in some examples, the total amount of money increases. Oh, sorry, I don't know why that little thumbs up came up. It's a weird AI thing. But nevertheless,
yes.
If the total amount of money might increase. Australia's APCO, who is just planning to pass EPR, is looking at it in that fashion. And we've seen other examples where that happens. In that case, more things get recycled because there's more subsidy if the total amount of money goes up. In some cases, it stays flat. It just moves it from property taxes to product price. And then no change happens really in recycling. And in some cases, it could actually take the amount of money flow down. And if it takes the amount of money flow down, less things get recycled. A really simple way to think about this, if I can just play a game with you, and then it will really articulate this. If you saw out of the corner of your eye, let's say you're in a building and it's just outside, in a public space, some money littered right now. What would be the smallest amount of money that would get you to get up out of your chair, pick it up, and come back? What would be the least amount of money you would do that for?
Maybe $20.
$20. Okay. Now that means you would be more excited if right. You would be more excited if it was a $50 bill or a $100 bill. Certainly, right?
Sure.
It would get you to do it even more. And the $10 bill, you would stay where you are. You would leave it, right? Now, my argument on why we don't get out for the $10 bill in this example is because the cost of going to get it, which is collection. You have to get out of your seat, you got to walk over, you got to put it in your pocket, this whole thing. That
effort
cost, plus the cost of processing. Cash is harder to spend today than digital currency, so it may be even annoying to get some value out of that bill. It doesn't make economic sense. And so that is exactly sort of open market recycling. The $20 bill is something like a PET bottle. You're willing to go get it. The $50 bill is something like aluminum. You're even more excited to get it. And the $10 bill is maybe something like a shopping bag. Now, how do I get you to get the shopping bag? Would it be fair to say that if I said, I pay you $10 for anything you go pick up, that means that the $10 bill is now worth $20, and you would hit your economic threshold to go get it, and the $20 bill is actually now worth $30, so you're even more excited to get it than before. Is that all fair?
Okay, I'm not real good with numbers, but yes, I'm following you.
Right. So if I paid you $10 for any type of money that you pick up, you'd be on top of what you get. You would be willing to pick up a $10 bill when you weren't before, right?
Correct. Yes.
Yes. Now, this is the critical thing on waste. Some waste streams are profitable to collect and recycle: corrugate, aluminum, PET. Yep. Other things, most things in fact, cost more to collect and process than the results are worth. If the total money flow in an ecosystem like EPR, when it's moving from municipalities to our product prices, actually goes up, like we are seeing in Australia, then it's like I pay you something to go pick anything up. Now, I may be subsidizing in waste management some component, but it doesn't matter. I'm subsidizing the system. If all that happened is money moved from pocket A to pocket B, or mechanism A really to mechanism B, then nothing will change. And if it goes down, actually less things get recycled. And we've seen all examples occur inside EPR. It is really in its core just this shift from municipality funded to producer funded, which means property taxes to product price.
Okay, but to play devil's advocate, if it is the citizen who always pays,
yes,
why create such a complex infrastructure and costly, system? We've got to pay employees to work in the EPR system. Yes. Why do all of that instead of just giving the consumer the money? They're the ones who have the material. They're the ones who have it.
You're absolutely right. The theory of it is is that it's better to have the generator of the waste, the one who actually makes the decision on what goes into the waste stream, have that fiscal responsibility, because in theory, then that generator will make better decisions. And that's why in some EPR regulation, we see things like certain bonuses if you choose certain pack forms, or certain penalties if you choose other pack forms. There is logic to that idea of the generator actually having the fiscal obligation, right? And then they can then make better generating decisions because they bear that fiscal obligation. That's
Which
the positive
is called
component.
The eco-modulation.
Exactly correct. Yes. Now, the question in all of this comes down to what's the volume of the money. If the volume of the penalty and so on is not meaningful, it will have zero effect. Then the producer will still just pick whatever is the most economic and convenient to them to use, which tends to be the stuff that's the least recyclable. If the penalties are greater, then there's going to be more of a net effect that occurs. And that's why the most important thing to say, because we're not necessarily, when EPR passes, it's not necessarily good or bad. It is just the shift of economics. And so the real thing to look at, we believe, is in the reading of the regulation, what is the total money flow? Has it shifted? That was the first point. And the second point to this eco-modulation, will the eco-modulation have any effect? Does it have enough teeth? Or is it more symbolic, where the effect is negligible and it's there, but really doesn't move the needle in any way?
Well, the other thing about the EPR laws in America, and actually the EPR law in Canada, is that, well, here in America, it's still being written. I talked with a gentleman a couple of weeks ago with a brand owner company in the natural products industry. And he told me that Canada has just now changed from the provinces to national for their EPR. They've harmonized, I guess would be the best word, across their provinces. And maybe because of that, they doubled the fees overnight, doubled the fees. So number one, that's something to think about, is as this program goes on, it could change and shift, and the economics could still get a little even more wonky, in my opinion. But the other thing with the here in the United States is the states that passed the laws before they were even written. We now have, Oregon has a final law, but the other 4 states that passed the laws are still writing them. And so it just seems like it's just, I just don't see the allure for this from both citizens as well as from businesses. But that kind of leads me to my next question for you. Tom, you're a businessman, and a very successful businessman, I might say, and you have a recycling company, correct? You would define your company as a recycling company. So as a businessman, what do you think of EPR? Not as an environmentalist. We all know that you are. But as a businessman, what do you think?
Absolutely. So I think here's the issue in environment, and then going right into waste, and then the answer to your question. But just sort of the preface. The big issue on environment is that stakeholders, especially corporations, do not have to pay for the externalities that they produce when they make their goods or transact their goods, right? Whether it's restoring air quality, water quality, solving the waste issues. We effectively get to do that for free, right? And not have to pay, and then some actor will have to pay into the future, our children or plants and animals and so on. That is the macro issue, right?
It's a sad state that we're at that point, that companies, people who run companies wouldn't be a little bit more ethical. But yes, that's exactly where we're at.
Yeah, and I think the issue in for them is that it's very difficult for one competitor to do it. If the others don't, then that one competitor goes away, right? Because it will not stay competitive.
It's not a fair playing field. Exactly.
It's not, no. So what is really valuable, and we say, for example, at TerraCycle, we are voluntary, we are VPR, like voluntary product responsibility. So when we go in without this sort of regulatory backbone, we are trying to convince companies to do this on a voluntary basis, right? Which is not necessarily easy. Now, so any regulation that mandates taking responsibility over an externality, we believe is a good thing. Why? Because it produces a money flow where there wasn't a money flow before. And this is where there is a good argument that producers should pay because they are the producers. They make the decision on what goes into the waste stream, what object they make, and they should have some fiscal sort of overlay, if you will, on that, so that they ideally make better decisions. This goes back to what we talked about earlier. It's all about the velocity and how much money and will it really have an effect. Now, so that generally is where we say that's a good thing. Where sometimes there's misunderstanding is we talk to many producers who think that if EPR comes into a state that they have no more waste issue whatsoever because now they're paying a bill. And the reality is that if you're making something like cosmetics, like a mascara wand or whatever, EPR doesn't have any effect on whether that mascara wand is going to get recycled or not. Just like if you're any object usually doesn't have an effect because it's only focused on packaging, right? So it's not a silver bullet. And in many cases, less things get recycled or the same gets recycled. In some cases, more gets recycled. It's actually about the amount of money flow that's being infused into the ecosystem. And so that's where what I would say as a VPR player, before EPR gets passed and then after it gets passed, it usually slows down voluntary activity because companies think, oh, it's going to solve everything and then I have to now manage it and I'm still understanding. And then once all the dust is settled, and they can see the new reality of what is getting recycled and not, that's when actually voluntary services are boosted because they now have an economic payment that they never had before. So in countries like France that has had EPR for a very, very long time on a federal basis, when we launch, say, a TerraCycle program to collect and recycle baby food pouches, let's say we collect 5% of the baby food pouches that producer puts out, that means they can reduce their EPR obligation to the PRO they're paying by that 5%. And that's an added benefit to create tailwind for voluntary programs. But I would say 2 years before EPR's, so 2 years before EPR's passed, maybe even a year or two after, it's headwind, and then it immediately shifts into tailwind. And the headwind really is people thinking it's much more than it really is.
Tom, do you know, here in the United States, the EPR laws as they're being written, does it have that provision for voluntary, kind of like a credit for voluntary programs? I haven't heard.
Yes, I would say that we believe so because we are talking to the states to make sure that is a component. And I would say almost all EPR regulation around the world in the countries we operate has that built in because it's a very reasonable thing to say, look, if you company set up your own platform to take back material, you should get credit for that. That is usually almost table stakes in the EPR regulations. And so it is, we have not seen examples where that's not in play, right? But there are many, many different, sort of EPR regulations out there, if you will.
Okay, that kind of was one of the questions that I was going to ask, and I'm going to ask it anyway because I just want a flat answer. So do you think that EPR laws would replace voluntary producer responsibility programs, projects, however you want to call it, or maybe even look at it a little bit more broadly? Will it replace a company's or an organization's voluntary sustainability goals here in the United States?
So I would say, because you asked for a very direct question, I say the direct answer is no. But to add a bit more detail, as we talked about earlier, in the short term. So I define short term as 2 years before it is like fully enacted, and then 1 year after. Usually what happens 2 years before is no one really knows what it's going to be. You even mentioned they're passed but not written yet. That's exactly the case. A lot of confusion, maybe a bit too much optimism around them. And so that in the 2 years prior, it does slow down VPR. And then after it's passed, a lot of the effort goes into now administering that work, and that's new administration. Sure. So that creates some headwind. And as soon as that digestion is over, then it is tailwind because the company is now spending money, and they would effectively get a credit by doing VPR, a credit that they never had before. And so as we think, and now as a company who's 23 years old, more long-term thinking, we'd say generally it is good for voluntary programs, but important to note that sort of subtlety in the short term.
Sure, understood. Okay, so getting into some of the details about this, there's two critical aspects of recycling success that I don't believe EPR laws directly address. The first one is consumer involvement. They're the ones who have the material at the
Right.
point where you're making the decision, recycle it, collect it for recycling or throw it away. So that's number one. The second aspect of it is after you've collected the material and recycled it, recycling is a business, and those recycling companies need to sell that material to make money. Subsidies, regardless of the subsidies, let's just say this is a business. TerraCycle has been successful on both those counts as a voluntary system. And
Yeah.
I know that this is your business and it could be proprietary, but I'm going to ask anyway. What's your
Please.
secret? And what can other people learn from your example? Because these
Yeah.
are the two absolutely critical pieces that have to succeed.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think in general, what we say, and this then goes to what our secret is, and then towards how to think about this in EPR. What makes a waste stream recyclable is, if I simplify it to its core, is the cost of collecting it from the generator, the consumer, all the way to rendering it into a sellable output. If all those costs, collection, sorting, processing, and so on, are lower than what the stuff can be sold for, then recycling will naturally occur because it is effectively urban mining profitably. If the inverse is true, it will not occur, and producers will simply choose whatever is or generators will simply choose what is the cheapest way to dispose of the material while complying with laws, which would be landfilling or waste to energy, depending on the region of the world you're in. Europe's more waste to energy. America is more, or North America is more landfilling. That is sort of what drives circularity at its core. Now, so TerraCycle says, well, if we're going to deal with something that is incredibly negative from that economic threshold, it's like cigarette butts,
Unvaluable.
like costs more to collect and process than the results are worth. So it's funny when people say that thing is recyclable or non-recyclable, if they're comparing an aluminum can to a pen, what they really should not say is one is recyclable, the other is not recyclable. They should say one is profitable to recycle, the other is not profitable to recycle.
Exactly.
Right? Because if the more people center around that, it's all about the money flow, everything becomes very, very clear, inclusive of EPR. So what we say in a voluntary program, we'll call that VPR, is we say, hey, pen company, if you're willing to pay whatever it costs to collect that waste, and that is engaging with the generator, getting them excited and involved, in the case of writing instruments, the schools and businesses where pens and writing instruments are used, create the right incentive, marketing, communication, then the collection bins and the transportation, all the way to the sortation, and you are willing to cover what it costs to process these pens minus whatever we can sell them for, then we can set up pen recycling. And we have done that. We've collected and recycled hundreds of millions of pens, mind you, and thousands of other waste streams. But here's the secret sauce, because you asked about what's sort of the secret tension.
Yes.
In a voluntary program, if I just go to a pen company and say, for every 1,000 pens we collect and recycle, we need whatever, $10 from you. I'm making this number up, right?
Right.
Then they're going to look at that as an investment to solve a challenge they have. But the more successful the program becomes, the more money they pay. And that's a really difficult tension to handle. So what we then say is, to solve for that tension, let's make sure that investing in voluntary pen recycling helps your business, maybe gain market share, get more brand visibility, whatever it may be, right? But the more we can show value, then people will scale up these VPR programs. And in some cases, it's phenomenally large. We're the world's largest coffee capsule recycler, and some coffee capsule programs are collecting and recycling 1 in 3 capsules produced in a particular country, or blister packs at 20% of what the country produces. So they can get incredibly large if you play that relationship between value generated, not from the material value, but from other things, versus the cost properly. Now, and that's the key lesson in EPR, right? Why, for example, in a country like Germany, which has had EPR for decades at robust levels, billions of euro flowing through the entire Dualis system with all the PROs there, why are something like juice pouches or cosmetic packaging still just incinerated? is because the level of the subsidy produced by EPR is not enough to cover the actual cost of collection and processing. Now, here's the rub. If it was priced in such a way, it would make all these very cheap, disposable packages unaffordable to produce, and people would move to much more circular packages, but at a cost of all of our product prices going up. And that's, I think, the macro tension as we zoom out is the more, if it's producer funded, the more we're willing to pay for products, the more they can become circular, either by the producer voluntarily making them out of high value materials like aluminum that are intrinsically highly circular, or paying enough fee so that they can fund the actual cost of collecting and processing them. To put a fine point on it, it would be if you did EPR on diapers, the cost of diapers would probably double, right? In the sense that the cost of collecting and recycling a diaper is probably the same as the cost of making one. I'm being, generalistic here, but but if we were willing to bear that cost, then off we go.
Okay, well, I know you have been successful with the dirty diaper
Sure.
recycling.
Yeah.
So you've kind of proven that out.
Yeah, but at that type of investment from producers like Pampers or Huggies, right? That's what it then takes to be able to do. But if that economics can be marshaled, then off we go.
Okay, so Tom, you've been successful in convincing a lot of different companies to do what I would say voluntary EPR programs. So why do we need a forced EPR program? Why do we need a law?
Yeah, it's, why? Because only some people volunteer, right? It's a difference between, say, in the military, a draft and voluntary enrollment, right? You bring out a draft only in the situation where you don't have enough voluntary enrollment, or why would you need one? And it's the exact same thing here, is that there is not enough voluntary activity. And that's why you see this overall mandate. I think the other components are the following, though. The real sort of big drive is the world is getting worse from a waste point of view. We are recycling less than we were before. Yeah. And we're producing more, right? So the total tonnage of waste is exploding. The environmental externalities of this are massive, and I think citizens are looking to do anything they can, and advocating for EPR is one such outcome, right? I think as we look at it, right, EPR is not good or bad in its core. It is simply a shift of the money flow. The real question that makes EPR, I'd say, effective or ineffective is what are all the other components beyond that fiscal shift that are written into it? How's the capital deployed? What is it spent on? Is it, to your point, engaging consumers? Or is it subsidizing places that really need subsidy? Is it eco-modulating in a way that's actually going to have a real effect? Is it helping maybe subsidize a circular economy initiative that really needs subsidy, like reuse? A good example there in France, France's biggest PRO called CTO, in fact, all of them are legally mandated to spend 5% of their inbound receipts on funding reuse. It's one of the reasons, for example, TerraCycle's Loop program is thriving in France and has struggled everywhere else, because that subsidy is one of many things that really help. But that's how the regulation is written, and that's what I think makes EPR either work well or have no effect, or in some cases have negative effect, as in less things get recycled.
Okay. I understand all of that. I still think that if voluntary programs can work, maybe we're just running out of time. Like you say, there's a little bit more of an urgency as the volume of waste rises, and some companies are, let's just, euphemistically say, slow to come to the table. Getting that stick out. Okay. I wish we didn't need it, but I understand. I understand the whole. So I understand. But there's one other point that I've made in presentations recently that have got people thinking.
Yeah.
And I wish I could say this was my idea. It wasn't. It was something that I heard at a conference probably more than 2 decades ago. And a lot of times when we look at some new technology or a new system, we think economies of scale. But scale also has a negative aspect to it where it might lower the costs, but it increases the complexity of actually getting a project off and running. And sometimes that complexity is kind of hard to overcome. So I'm just wondering if instead of one big solution, which I think I would describe EPR as like a big solution, could smaller ones, maybe replicated multiple times, do the job?
I think you're absolutely right. And it's not even an opinion. If you look at where EPR has existed for a long time in the US, it is around what you would call regulated and universal waste streams, batteries, paint, aerosols, e-waste. There's a lot of extended producer responsibility regulation that's been in place in the US for quite a while, especially where there are hazards around these waste streams. And these are, exactly to your point, highly specialized regulatory frameworks for those incredibly specific waste streams, and they tend to work really, really well. So, there is a really good argument, that you're making that, hey, if we had an EPR only around flexible films versus packaging, would the flexible film one do better? And you're probably absolutely right, it would, because it would be more thoughtful to the issues of that particular waste stream. And each waste stream is like a different animal, right? It has different intrinsic issues. Where is it generated? What is its overall economic cycle? What is it like to handle? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So
the ebbs and flows of the economics of it all. Yep.
Yes. I mean, I think if we had a silver bullet on the regulatory framework of the country, I would say make everything federal, because it's really difficult to deal with 50 different regulatory environments state by state by state, and make it specific. The more specific to a waste stream, the better. In fact, ironically, as I say that, it sort of echoes how we set up programs. We set up programs at a waste stream level, at a federal level. So it's coffee capsules for the country or oral care waste for the country, because it's the most pragmatic way to manage. Now, empathetically, though, we live in an environment today that it's not easy to pass regulation. And I think that there's also an opportunistic lens that needs to be layered over. Are we going to have any federal environmental regulation that's inspiring? Probably not for a while. Even under, Democratic leadership, it was very difficult to pass such type of regulation, because at a federal level, we're not good at probably anything other than deregulating today, because of the nature of, the way the chess pieces are on the chessboard. So it really does need to come to a state level. And then I think at a state level, the question is, how much appetite is there? How many regulatory bits can you get through, right? In some states, there's appetite for many. California, right, is a good example where it got to pass truth in labeling regulation and EPR. But there's other states where maybe there's just political appetite for one. And if you only have political appetite for one at a state level, well, okay, then you go for a more of a catch-all, right? And I think that's also what we're seeing is we're matching like what's optimal with what can pragmatically actually go through the political system today.
Okay. Is there anything that I haven't thought to ask you about extended producer responsibility, specifically here in the United States? You're a global company. Is there anything that I haven't thought to ask that now that we're talking about this, that you feel compelled to share?
Yeah. I think you've asked it. What I would say is like the things to really watch for, right? What we watch for. Generally speaking, EPR creates this shift, as I mentioned. It is not a silver bullet, right? There's so many folks who say, oh, now all our problems are solved. It could have no effect on the actual circular economy itself. It is simply shifting who pays the bill. Actually, not who, how it's paid, right? From our cost of living to our cost of products.
Yes.
That's what it is in its core. Then the real question to watch for is, what's the total money flow? Is it going to go up, neutral, or down? That's be as optimistic to pessimistic based on seeing that. Then it's about, will the money flow have effects on decision making? This is the eco-modulation. And then all the other little bits and pieces that are put in there, how is the money going to be deployed? And is that really going to have the right interventions? I think those are the things to watch for. Because if it's done well, it could be really good, but it could also be a lot of work for no outcome if it's done modestly or poorly. And it could even be a step back. So It is
That's
just
what
a
I'm
new
most afraid
framework.
of.
Yeah, it's just a new framework we're playing in. It's nothing more. And I think if anyone feels that if they think, if anyone's perceiving EPR as a silver bullet, then be cautious and instead marshal all of that into making it stronger by making sure those things are present and really going to create the changes that we're all fighting for.
Okay. One of the concerns that I have, though, is I'm all for, this sounds pretty good. Let's try it. I'm
Yeah.
all for that. New ideas are always welcome. But what's the end game then, Tom? What if
Yeah.
EPR doesn't work? How do we get rid of it?
Well, it's interesting because let's just take the if it works component, right? The easier part of this question.
Sure.
It doesn't go away. It is just a permanent solution, right, if you will, to the economic issue. Because the big problem with the way our products are made is they're always cheaper tomorrow than they are today. The biggest mega trend in product design and object design is cost reduction. And if we keep reducing cost of our goods, not just packages, but also any good, right, T-shirts to benches, you name it, their intrinsic circularity will go down. Because intrinsic circularity, that is circularity naturally occurring without any forces, subsidizing it, is there when there's high value in goods. Think, refurbishable mobile phones have high intrinsic circularity. Rolex watches have high intrinsic circularity. Precious metals, all these things that you don't need to fund it. It naturally has value. It's like no one complains about, luxury watch litter, right? Because it will always fuel itself. But the opposite is true at the other end. Really cheap things, you got to pay someone to collect and process it. And so this is the key thing I think that we need to be aware of, is that it's always, if we're going to make things cheaply, we will always need some either mandatory or voluntary sort of money flow to go clean it up and to do a good job in cleaning it up, meaning that the materials go around and don't just end up in a landfill or an incinerator. So there is no endpoint until that macro tension, if you will, in product design changes and we start making things better tomorrow than today, as in higher quality, more value in them, which is not the trend at the moment. Until then, there needs to be a money flow of some kind or multiple kinds.
Okay. All right. Well, we will see soon enough, now that Oregon has passed its law. We'll see how that works here in the United States and see how the other 4 states write their laws and what other regulatory activity we see with EPR for packaging here in America. The thought processes that I had, I just want to ask you what you think of the logic of this.
Shoot, yes.
For EPR to work, it's a 3-step
3-part
premise.
Okay. Yes.
For EPR to work, recycling has to work. For recycling to work, it has to be economically viable.
Yep.
Bottom line is, the third point, if recycling is economically viable, it'll happen whether we have EPR or not.
Correct. I'm fully aligned with all 3 of those. And you know what? Can I just build one point? This is a sub-point of 3. It's not its own point.
Yes.
Recycling will work to a point where infrastructure will magically appear.
Yes, once it's economically viable. Yep.
Correct. All the requirements will be there, right?
So Tom, why can't we make voluntary recycling or voluntary, EPR work? Why does it have to be a law?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's because people aren't volunteering at the right volume. They're not enough people volunteering, and they're not volunteering at big enough emphasis.
Yep.
Right.
Okay, well, we're still going to keep working on it, right?
Well, of course we are. Absolutely. There's no question. But I think that's the issue, right? But I'm so glad that like that focus you have of like it's all about the economics is the everything in this.
It is, but that doesn't mean that it can be solved. Although I like your underlying point where you emphasize it, that this is to help the manufacturers make better decisions.
Yeah.
because then a better decision won't be as costly as the bad decision is saving them.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. The issue, right, and this, where I agree, it's like the eco-modulation is so small, it hardly ever has an effect anywhere.
Really?
The benefit of
Okay.
going to that shittier, cheaper package far outweighs the penalty you pay for it.
All the time?
Almost always today.
Okay.
And why? Because there isn't enough appetite to make the cost of our goods high enough.
Correct.
Right?
But you just explained why EPR can't work then.
No, it could if it was that
manufacturers have to spend more money on their packaging to hit the eco-modulation balance that they want,
right.
but
Right.
they raise their prices that consumers can't afford it. I mean, we're still in this, it just seems like, talk about a circular problem.
It is but the genesis of the circular problem is not anything other than we consumers like to buy cheap goods.
So maybe every rigid plastic package should be PET and just be done with it, right? Or aluminum,
well,
or
yeah,
steel.
it would be, sure. But like, if you compare the ability to pass a regulatory framework like that versus EPR, there's no way that the first one would go through and be passed, right? It's not to say it's not academically correct. I think the big overlay here is what can also be passed, and actually become law.
Right. However, you're very close on the brand side of things, and you are an expert marketer. So you're going to understand this. How can brands still use packaging as a differentiator with these EPR stipulations and or maybe constraints?
Oh, I mean, they certainly can. It's not that constraining is the point, I think there's still a huge palette of choices that you can make. Just to compare and contrast, right? Like, imagine if you are in Germany and you have a soda or a beer, let's say, and you need to use a standard bottle for your reusable system there. Then the only differentiation you have is a label. And people can handle that just fine. They can handle that.
Okay.
Oh my God, on EPR through recycling, your palette is massive.